Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. It's presented by the College Connections Conference and sponsored by FAU Card. The mission of FAU Center for Autism and Related Disabilities provides expert counseling, training, and support at no charge for all people across all race, ethnic, and gender groups with autism and related disabilities, their families, employers, the professionals, and community and governmental agencies serving them. FAU Card provides support and assistance with the goal of optimizing the potential of all people across all race, ethnic, and gender groups with autism and related disabilities. Where we serve, as you can see by the map, 5 counties: Indian River, St. Lucia, Martin, Okeechobee, Palm Beach, 3 offices in Boca Raton, Jupiter, and Port St. Lucie. I hope I got those right. As somebody from Michigan and Pennsylvania, I'm not sure if I pronounced those, so I apologize if I didn't. And all of these combined provide one dynamic service. My presentation today, this webinar, thank you for joining me virtually, is on preparing students with disabilities for college success as part of the CARD College Connections Conference. And my name is Dr. Wendy Caduti, and I'm an associate faculty member at Penn State University. The objectives for today's webinar is to identify some common experience that students with disabilities face in post-secondary settings and what we have learned from that research. When you hear me say post-secondary settings, please note that that could mean anything related to college or universities. We're also going to look at identifying factors and to help people start to identify what to consider when trying to find that right fit when you're looking at post-secondary options for your students. We'll also be discussing how to identify barriers that impact learning and accommodations for students with disabilities. Identify best practices in advocating for needed accommodations and supports in a post-secondary setting. And also, recently added with our changes in our environment is best practices for online learning. So who am I? This is my 8th year at Penn State University. I'm an associate professor in the Rehab and Human Services program under the Ed Psych Counseling and Special Education Department within the College of Education. I teach in our Rehab and Human Services undergraduate program and also in our Master's Clinical Rehab and Mental Health program. The classes that I teach are employment strategies for people with disabilities, medical aspects of disability, and disability culture. I also came into academia after having a career of about 15 to 20 years, working in human resources, working with people with disabilities in staying at work or returning to work, individuals who had an injury, accident, illness, or disease. So along with having the educational piece, I also come with years of experience of having worked in this field. I also worked, more related to this presentation, at Michigan State University in Career Services. And there I was a liaison between our Disability Services Office and Career Services in helping students with disabilities navigate that move from a student into the workforce. And from that, I learned a lot on what employers were looking for and how best to get students with disabilities ready for that world of work, which is changing even as we speak right now. I also am the co-founder and the co-director of our WorkLink program at Penn State University. We are in our 2nd year, and that's a program, post-secondary 2-year certificate program for students with intellectual disabilities. And I do that with my colleague, Allison Fleming. My research interests in areas which relate specifically to this presentation, and I will go into a little bit more detail on some of the studies that I've done in this area, are college students with disabilities. My other research area is mental health in the workplace. So students with autism in college, one of the pieces you're going to hear me talk about throughout this presentation is taking that research piece and pulling that into practice. So the research, while it was in a broader focus of looking at students with disabilities, it relates specifically to students with autism for a variety of reasons, which you'll see when I get further into the presentation. But we also have to consider that there isn't a lot of specific differences when it comes to these best practices. So I wanted to highlight first, starting out with what does it look like for students with autism in college. I wanted to share some resources. There's a College Autism Network. If you haven't heard of this before, there's a lot of great information and resources in there. There's also thinkcollege.net. It's a little bit more focused towards students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but they also have a lot of great resources, webinars, and I'd be happy to share any of that information with anybody that might be interested. So one thing I wanted to discuss first and foremost is the prevalence rate of autism. And I'm sure you all have heard of the statistic of 1 in 68 people are diagnosed with ASD. Yet only 1 in 225 in college self-reported as a person with autism. So why don't students disclose? This is no different than any disability population. About half of all students with disabilities do not get registered with their disability services office when they enter into that post-secondary setting. And there's a variety of reasons. One is the biggest one is stigmatization. So students don't want to be seen as a student with a disability. For a lot of students, they've been navigating their education K through 12. So they feel as if they've learned the different types of accommodations, strategies, resources that they need to be successful. So for a lot of students, they want to come in and try it. They want to come into college and see if they can do it without having to register. And I think that's okay. What I think we should do is, as part of those best practices, is work with students on that so that they can understand at what point do I really need to get registered in order to get an accommodation. So oftentimes we'll see students coming in really floundering their first or second year until they come to terms with having to go and get those accommodations, which is what they're there for. So we really want to help students understand, yes, go ahead and if you want to try it, but where can those supports be in case you need them, and not have to wait for too long for them to get those supports they need and fall further back into their academic success. The other thing to realize is that navigating how to get accommodations, navigating how to register with their Office of Disability Services is different with each and every college and university. So it's really important, and we'll get to this in some of the best practices, of thinking ahead of time what colleges and universities your student might be interested in, or you as a student might be interested in. Start looking at their websites about getting registered. What's that process? What documentation is needed? Is it an online form? Is it an in-person form? And the variability across this requirement for documentation is pretty significant. So it's important to know ahead of time. A lot of students will go and do campus visits. And if you are a student with a disability, it's good to go and visit the Disability Services Office to learn what type of resources they have, services. How long does it take to get registered? You'll see with disability services offices, especially at the beginning of the semesters, their turnaround time might be a little bit longer just because the sheer number of students they're trying to get registered and get accommodations for. So if that's a 1 to 2 month process, it's important to know that that process of getting registered should really start earlier on. A couple of other pieces as to why students don't disclose. They might not see their disability as a disability. And this is something that's not very uncommon. We see people with disabilities that this is just part of who they are. They don't necessarily identify as somebody with a disability. So that can be another barrier as well. Another study I wanted to bring to your attention, and this all comes from the College Autism Network, is a study that was done by Taylor and DeWalt, and they reported that half of all their participants, and all of their participants were people with autism, experienced some type of disruption. And that disruption was they either got fired or they had to leave college. So half of all of their participants experienced some sort of disruption. But the good news is that 7 out of 8 found another opportunity prior to the end of the study. What I always try to do when I'm working with students with disabilities is to normalize their experience. If we think about it, this is no different than any other student. If you talk to people and ask, you know, where did you go to college? A lot of people say, well, I started here, then I transferred here, or they didn't have the program I liked, so I went to another university, or maybe I switched my major. So that's not an uncommon process. So I think we need to normalize that so students with disabilities don't feel bad if they do have to leave the university or college or take a time out in order to attend to themselves. But my hope is that after this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of the different resources and supports in what questions to ask, how to be an informed consumer to help try to make that fit, the first fit that you apply to in the first college that you get accepted into. So students with autism in college, some of the pieces, again, I think I wanted to start out so we can come back and visit these, is the factors that were identified by students with autism that influence their college success. These are the same as any other students with disabilities you'll see through some of our research findings in a few slides, in that similarity. So why there is really no difference between students with different types of disabilities. These big umbrella success pieces are the same. There just might be a little bit tweaks here and there of how we go about that based on the specific type of disability, which we'll talk about. So parental expectation, support, motivation, student support network is pretty important, and that comes from a variety of resources, including the family, friends, support personnel. Self-determination, one of the pieces I'll talk about in this webinar is how can we help students start to get some of that self-determination, how to advocate for themselves, how they can practice that before they're already in taking classes at the college level. And all of this is stuff that we all learn by trial and error. So it's important that we practice this early on. The other thing that influences college success is goals of employment. Have students done some job shadowing? Have students do they have work experience? Are they working part-time while they're going to college? That's a big one, and coming from the HR side of things, and I'll talk to that piece a little bit more when we get to the 12 essential skills that employers are looking for. The different type of resources and accommodations. I think this is really where that success in college is so dependent on doing the homework up front and understanding for each individual student, what are their specific needs, what are their specific requirements, what type of accommodations, and trying to find the college that meets most of those, if not all of those. And overall general support. A lot of this is with the campus climate, campus community, how involved, how accepted students feel. And that's a really significant piece that we can't forget. And again, that's the same for all students. So we really need to normalize this process, that the best practices of what we're looking for students with autism are the best practices for any college student. So what do we know about students with disabilities? Well, we know that students with disabilities are attending college at a higher rate, which is fantastic. More and more students with disabilities across the board are entering into post-secondary settings. However, the biggest barrier is them staying there. So the graduation and the retention rate of students with disabilities is much lower than with their peers who don't have disabilities. So it's about 40% lower than students without disabilities. So that's a pretty significant factor. And we'll look at some of those issues as to why that retention rate is not so good when we look at students with disabilities. So a couple of the pieces: inadequate skills to negotiate the demands of college. Again, this is true for every student. Getting in there, learning in college, and I can tell you as somebody who's been teaching in a Big Ten university for 12 years now, students all struggle coming into college with trying to navigate the learning system. It's different. Learning how to learn in college is a lot different than what we know of how we learn in K through 12. Even for students that take AP classes, even for students that are very strong academically, there's always a learning curve. And what I try to do is tell my students each semester is it's going to be different for every single class you have. It's going to be different for every single professor you have. Everybody teaches a little bit differently. The content is presented a little bit differently. The class time is different. The class length of time is different. So it's really important to understand that the classroom settings within college can vary significantly. So it's, again, good to know what the needs of that student are. There's also limited financial, psychological, and environmental supports, and that really plays into the campus climate around how supportive they are for people with disabilities. And again, if you can get in and talk with your disability supports office up front in the university as you're going through and making that decision of what college would be the best fit for me. I can't say that enough. That is probably the biggest piece that you can do in order to make that match. The other piece is insufficient self-advocacy. Getting students to know how to advocate for themselves is huge, and something that can be practiced along the way through that K through 12. And a lack of higher education programs that coordinate services. So not in every college, not in every university, because so for example, disability services and career services and the counseling center might all be in the same building. Disability services, counseling, and career services might be under the same department. In other universities, disability services is in one building that falls under one department. Career services is in another. The process for, if I'm a student with a disability and I want to get and talk with somebody in career services, that person in career services might not have experience working with people with disabilities. They might not know about how you go about asking for an accommodation in the workplace. They might not know about legal or illegal interview questions that can be asked of people with disabilities. So even though that might not be available at your college or university in that structure, it's important to find those supports elsewhere. So are you working with a case manager? Do you have supports through the state system, through a nonprofit, through your own network, in order to help fill those gaps for where the university might not have that structure set up? As I said before, not all students register with the Student Disability Services offices. And mental health might not always be included in the disability discussion. You'll hear me talk a lot about mental health because that's my research area, but also because that's the largest population of students with disabilities that we see across college campuses, as well as in the employment sector within HR as well. But it's important that we understand this for a couple of different reasons, is that not everybody has just one disability. Anxiety, depression are very prevalent. So oftentimes we have co-occurring disabilities. Also because the stressors in college can help or can exacerbate underlying mental health conditions. 18 to 25 is when those mental health conditions, if they hadn't previously been diagnosed, now people start to exhibit symptoms, and that's when many mental health conditions are diagnosed. So it would be irresponsible of me to not really focus on that mental health piece, because it is so critical. So one of the pieces, as I mentioned before, 18 to 25 is when most of those mental health conditions first present. We've seen a significant increase in the amount of mental health diagnoses on college campuses. We've gotten better at diagnosing those. People are more aware of those. But also because the stressors that students experience in college, some of those listed here, are ones that they hadn't experienced before. The other piece is that a majority of students who are depressed and or suicidal are not seeking treatment. The timeframes for getting into counseling on a college campus, college counseling centers are overwhelmed, they're understaffed, as are mental health counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists in any corner of the United States. It might take some time in order to get an appointment. It might take some time in order to find the right match of who can provide the best treatment that somebody might need. So if you are in need of counseling or identify that, I think it's important to have that set up before starting college. because once you get into college, it might not be as easy to find those resources in a quick matter if that's needed. So I'm going to go over a couple of studies that we did, some colleagues and myself. And the first study was an exploratory study. We did not know the mental health needs of students with disabilities. There's CCMH, which is the Collegiate Center for Mental Health, is data collected from over 140 college and university counseling centers across the United States. So, and I think that number has increased significantly since 2013-14 as far as the actual number of colleges. So this CCMH data set is housed at Penn State University. It collects data from 140 different counseling centers in colleges across the US. So there are a significant amount of resources through that data set to better understand mental health in college students. One of the factors in that survey that's selected is, are you a student registered with the Disability Services Office? So we have a category to be able to identify students with disabilities who are seeking counseling. And again, we have to realize that there are students with disabilities that would fall as a person with a disability under the ADA who are also receiving services from CCMH but have not checked off that box that I'm a registered student with a disability, because as I mentioned on a couple slides ago, not all students register. If you have a diagnosis for anxiety, depression, you're considered a person with a disability under the ADA. So I want to preface this by saying the numbers and what we're going to discuss here are not just the only students with disabilities in this data set. It's just the ones that check that box. Oops, sorry. So we asked 4 general questions. How much distress do students with disabilities experience across different problem areas common to college students? Is that distress similar to students without disabilities? How similar are issues for students with disabilities who seek or do not seek counseling? And does the amount of distress experienced vary by disability? So those are what we looked at. So the biggest thing that came out of this study was that students with disabilities are pretty similar to students without disabilities, which is, it might not seem like much, but to us as researchers, that's a big deal. So what that means is oftentimes if somebody's in a counseling session and they disclose they have a disability, that might become the focus of the counseling session, or it might be assumed that it's related to being a person with a disability. So for us to say students with disabilities are just like students without disabilities for the issues that they're seeking counseling for, that's great news. So there was really no difference on depression, hostility, family distress, or eating concerns. These were the large categories that are measured through the different survey tools we use at CCMH. The areas where students with disabilities had higher scores, and again, I think this is important because this helps us identify where students with disabilities may be having issues. So how can we be more preventative and help them entering into college find those supports and services that they needed? So the big pieces were generalized anxiety and academic distress. And this was both for clinical and non-clinical samples. So the other thing I want to mention is within this data set, we looked at students who were in counseling, but there was also another large data set where students answered the same questions, did the same assessments, but were not officially seeking counseling. So it's just your general student college population not seeking counseling. So that's the clinical versus non-clinical. So again, those were very similar, which is important. Lower substance use than students without disabilities. Social anxiety scores were higher for students with disabilities, and there was no other group differences on social anxiety. So it's good for us to kind of get an idea of where students with disabilities may show higher distress than students without. The other piece that we looked at within this data set were whether or not students ever engaged in non-suicidal or self-injurious behavior. There's a question on there, have you ever contemplated suicide? Have you ever attempted suicide? So this one was a way for us to be able to dig a little bit deeper in the data to see where there's some self-harming or suicide tendencies of students with disabilities. And what we found is that students with disabilities in counseling engaged in more non-suicidal self-injurious behavior than students without. Students without disabilities in the non-clinical sample engaged in less non-suicidal self-injurious behavior than any other group. Students with disabilities, both in the clinical and non-clinical sample, had the highest level of suicide ideation. And previous suicide attempts were reported more frequently among students with disabilities than students without, whether or not they were in counseling. So this really was something we hadn't seen before through data or understood through data. So was, while not necessarily good news, it allows us to then figure out what can we do up front to help mitigate this moving forward. So students with psychological disabilities engaged in more non-suicidal injurious behavior. So we grouped disability by sensory disability, physical disability, learning disability, and psychological disabilities. So the students that fell into that psychological disability engaged in more non-suicidal behavior. More than half of the students with psychological disabilities had seriously considered suicide, and it was higher than any other disability type. And rates of suicide attempts were more than 2 times greater for students with psychological disabilities than students with physical or learning disabilities. So for us, that gives us a better idea of where different supports and services should be added. It allows us to share this with other folks in colleges and universities to say this is something that hasn't shown up before, that we weren't aware of. So where can we, for say, student disability services offices, is there a way to create a more seamless process to get students into counseling if that's needed? It helps us identify where some of those barriers might be, that we can take those away to make some of these issues less present for students with disabilities, okay? So as I said before, the good news, students with disabilities are very similar to students without. It's important for us as professionals, and I think professionals, not just when they get to college, but K through 12, for parents, for supports, for caregivers, for friends, for nonprofits, for education, for all of us to have this understanding so we can be on the lookout and help provide resources where necessary. For students not in counseling who reported having psychological disability, counseling centers should look at creating opportunities for students in this population to seek treatment. One of the things that we know is that there's a shortage of counselors, there's a shortage of resources in this area. So it's important that we find a way to get students the help that they need. So here's just some other implications, pieces that I had talked about a little bit more about the different silos, I guess, in universities that should be paying attention to this. But again, as I mentioned, I think it's important for all of us that work in this field to have that understanding. So the second study I want to talk about is a qualitative study that some colleagues and myself did. This was a smaller study, 26 students. It was all students attending a 4-year university, and we wanted to ask them about their experience. So we had 4 guiding questions. Describe your college experience. What strategies did you use to help you during college? What services or persons were beneficial? And what suggestions would you make to the university administrators to improve support services for students with disabilities? So what we wanted to do is get a bunch of students with disabilities in the room and say, what's worked? What hasn't worked? What do you need? And what have you done to be successful? Because one thing we know is that students will go to other students first to get a better understanding of how they've navigated the system. So it's important for us to go to students as well and ask those same questions. So student needs, college, and we categorize these into large groupings. The first one was college integration. You heard me talk about that early on, about being able to feel connected to the college or university, campus climate. So college integration, orienting to campus, adjusting to higher academic demands, making friends, joining activities. How does disability viewed on that campus is very important. The disability experience, we had more negative comments, especially around social stigma, that life is harder, that there might not always be the supports. And there was also a pride in knowing that I, as a person with a disability, have found ways to navigate and be successful in college. So student strategies were making those connections, accommodation, self-advocacy, disability specific. So that might be if I have a specific disability and I need medical treatment, or I need a specific provider, or the big one is how do I navigate getting my medications. So those students that had figured that out and had thought about that ahead of time reported more success in those areas. Employment as well, being able to have some previous experience of navigating careers or thinking about that earlier on. First year students' recommendations, academic, transportation, campus resources, advocacy structure, just getting in and understanding how colleges and universities operate and where the heck do I go for help is important. And we might think, just go look on the web, but websites aren't always the easiest to navigate. It might be very difficult to understand what's step 1, step 2, step 3. Where is this building even located? What if your hours don't match with my availability? So the more that students know that ahead of time going in and have a plan for action, the more successful students will be. So how do university policies, resources, and staff practices impact the student experience? That's the other piece that we wanted to know. And this is the area that we have the most work that needs to be done. When I say that we have a low retention rate and graduation rate of students with disabilities, that's the fault of the universities. Not every student is going to be a match, but to assume that 40% of students, there's 40% fewer students with disabilities staying in and graduating colleges when compared to students without disabilities, that's not all the fault of students with disabilities. That's the fault of colleges and universities in not having those supports and resources, and even an understanding of students with disabilities. One of the big pieces is a lack of research in this area within higher education journals. So this is where colleges and university experts will go to better understand how can we make a more supportive environment, successful college experience for students that fall into different categories. Students that fall into students with disabilities, there's not a lot of research in that area being pushed into higher education journals. As you can see, there was a study done from 1990 to 2010, and they found that only 1% of the articles contained information about students with disabilities. And when you know that students with not just students, but disability is the largest minority population globally, about 20% of the global population is a person with a disability. 1 in 4, so 25% of the population will have a diagnosable mental health condition across their lifetime. A disability is the largest minority population. So to consider that that's not being recognized and brought into higher education as far as a better understanding of what that group might need in order to be successful is something that we have to change. We're working on it. So Disability Services Office, students had different, again, we had positive and we had negatives. You know, we asked, what did you like? What did you not like for all of these different questions? So students had some very specifics of what they were looking for and what they wanted to see in disability supports offices. So I think if you can get into a university ahead of time and meet with those staff, understand their process, understand what the needs of your student or you as a student with a disability are, and then finding that best fit will get you 10 steps ahead of where everybody else is. Okay. There was also information as far as the faculty experience. The other piece that we need to improve is faculty. We need to improve faculty's understanding of disability. We need to have a better understanding for faculty in accommodations, how to provide those accommodations, and provide the faculty resources and training in this area. That's one of the big pieces that colleges and universities really need to do, is to help educate and provide resources for faculty to help them understand how can I create the most inclusive and the most accommodating classroom experience. Okay. So the other thing that students had that in our study that highlighted areas that made them successful was their awareness of resources. So where did students go to get their information? So some of them were external resources, university resources. The big one is a student network. So students joining student organizations, students joining clubs, students joining advocacy support groups, and getting those resources from other students is really important. So most students, I won't get into these, you'll have access to the presentation, but I wanted to show some of the areas that were seen as adequate or inadequate. I think the biggest thing is the hoops that students have to jump through in order to get registered, in order to get those accommodations, and in order to get the supports that they need. That process is very frustrating. And that's another reason why we'll see students not register, is because the process itself takes too long. So here were some recommendations for disability services offices. Again, you can use this information to ask those questions when you're visiting to see what type of hours they have, what's their staff to student ratio, how long do they allow for appointments, how long does it take to get an appointment. So there's a lot of information that we can gather from this study. So different recommendations for universities. Again, are we including disability as part of diversity? Are we having lectures and speakers and events around disability on our campuses? So important things to keep in mind. Are our websites accessible? That's a big one that is still up for debate in a lot of areas. Okay. The other thing, and this goes down to the students, what can I do as a student with a disability to better prepare myself for success in college? One of the big things is taking more rigorous classes. Learn that being challenged academically, practice that before you get into college. So can you take some college prep classes? Don't always, getting an A isn't the best outcome. I always tell students, if you learned about yourself, if you learned a better way to study, if you learned what worked for you, what didn't work for you, that's going to be more valuable to you moving forward than an A. Some other pieces, that development of self-advocacy and self-determination. What's different for students entering into college is in K through 12, the system's pretty much set up for them. They don't have to go out and seek the services, but that's completely flipped when you get to college. So even if you know where the Disability Services Office is, you might still be having to go out and seek additional supports and services, or you might have to go in and say, look, that accommodation isn't working for me, I need something else. So getting students to follow and have some opportunities to do some of that self-advocacy early on is very, very important. Okay. And often we have lower expectations of what students with disabilities can do. And it's important that for those of us that are supports and service providers, parents, friends, that we really pay attention to that and aren't putting invisible barriers in the way of students who have very successful futures. So some other things to consider, pieces that I talked about before is the institutional climate, the culture of support of students with disabilities, going there and visit before you go, universal design, all of these different pieces that I'll leave available for you to go back and read in more detail. So advocating for yourself is huge. And what I did with this slide is I broke it down by systems. So if we have K through 12, we have post-secondary, which is college, and then we have employment. So there's different ways for you to be able to advocate as a student with a disability in those different settings. So K through 12, we know this, there's built-in advocates, there's a very clear process, even though it might not feel like it when you're going through it, but it's much more structured. When you get to college, that's not the case. It's left up to the student to identify as a student with a disability, to seek those services, and to be in charge of getting the supports and services that they need. Okay, and oftentimes this isn't a very clear process and can be very frustrating for students. Okay, and there's also no lack of similarity. So what I can't do is tell you, when you get into college, do A, B, C, and D, because A, B, C, and D is going to be different for every single college and university. So if I'm going to tell you what to do, and I've told you already, is to go visit the colleges and universities you're interested in, visit with the Student Disability Services Office, go on their websites. You can do that now. Go on their websites and see how easy is it to navigate. Is there somebody that you can talk to ahead of time? So that's important. And then once you get into employment, again, the rules change, the laws changed. That process for getting an accommodation is different than it was through K through 12 or post-secondary. But there are some really specific resources for employers and guidelines under the ADA or ADAAA, the amendments since 2008. There's best practices. Employers are getting much better at this and are recognizing the value that people with disabilities bring to their business. So we're seeing, in my opinion, again, just my opinion, I'm seeing employment in accommodations as being 10 steps ahead of where colleges and universities are right now. And hopefully that can change. Again, we're working on it. So I wanted to make sure that you have an idea of what employers are looking for, because this is really important. So if we think to this previous slide, right, this is your process of why do you go to college? I'll ask this question every class I teach. Every semester, the first night or the first day, I'll ask students, why are you here? Why are you in this class? Why are you at this university? Sometimes it can take 10 or 15 minutes before I get the right answer, but the right answer is I'm here to get a job. That's what everybody is the end goal of college is to help get you training, help get you experience, help get you that degree in order to get a job. So it's really important that we understand what is it that employers are looking for and how can I build those skills while I'm in college? Because it's also important, those skills are the same ones that we need to build in K through 12 to help us be successful in college. And those are working in a diverse environment. Time management is essential. Being able to think critically, solving problems, communicating effectively, no matter what type of communication format is being used. And we've seen some significant changes and challenges with having to navigate virtually, as we all have been doing for the most part recently. Navigating across boundaries, understanding where do I go for help if I'm not getting the help. Where else can I go? Where do I find the information that I need? Balancing work life and embracing change. So these were all surveys that were done of employers that were recruiting from Michigan State University to ask, okay, you know, we know that if you're hiring for accountants, you want them to have this accounting degree. If you're hiring for nurses, you want them to have a nursing degree. But what else do you want? What are those skills? And these are the 12 essentials for success. These are the same skills that show up. They're called the soft skills, although now there's a change in HR from that language to being seen, rightly so, as more of the essential skills that are needed. So these are not unique just to college students, but these are better reflective of what it takes to be a good employee. So I always build my classroom around this. I try to bring this into every piece when we're talking about college and university and how to be successful, because you want to be able to find ways to get these experiences, and they don't have to be just through a job. You can get them through being a good group member in your class. You can get them through doing extracurriculars. You can get them through volunteering. You can get them through mentoring. So there's a lot of different ways you can get these experiences other than just a 20-hour a week paid part-time job. So students that are successful in college, that process starts in high school. We want to make sure that students with disabilities are taking rigorous classes, that they're challenging themselves in high school and not just when they get to college and there's so many other life changes and challenges that are going on. You learn more about yourself when you fail. You learn more about yourself when you, when the strategies that you had used in the past no longer work. You learn more about yourself when you have to figure stuff out in a new way. So it's really important that students are challenging themselves academically before they get to college. The development of that self-advocacy and self-determination, this is a hard one. I know this is a hard one. This is a hard one as a parent overall. My kids are 24 and 26, and I still find myself wanting to jump in and say, hey, let me just do that. Or let me, I'll look into that for you. So I think as parents, it's hard to shut off, but it's really important that we really promote self-advocacy and self-determination. So once students are getting closer to that college, are they running the IEP meetings? Are they going out and taking the lead in identifying 3 colleges that they might be interested in attending? Are they sending the email to say, we're coming for a campus visit and we would like to meet with your staff? We want to make sure that students are getting that opportunity to practice that every step of the way. And again, the making sure that we're looking at all career options and not assuming that students can't do something. Okay, so were some recommendations from NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness, for tips for preventing student dropouts, and I thought this was important to identify. So we know that college is stressful. We know that college is a big change. We know that navigating a new environment can be very difficult, and difficult for some students more so than others. So it's important that we recognize what are some tips that we can do. So making sure that students know where the accommodation and supports are at the college, at the university, but also in the local community and back home if that community is away from where the student is currently living. Encourage students to get help before the situation gets too bad. Encourage students to ask for supports before they are failing out of 3 classes. Encourage students to maybe seek counseling if they're running into some challenges or having the strategies that they relied on before are no longer working. Okay. Find ways to reach out to students who are struggling. And again, this is for students to know how to do this and where to look, but also questions that we can ask as supports in that student's lives. Okay. Reducing paperwork to get help. If we could do that, that would make life so much easier. So I think that's a big thing to look at when you're looking at the different resources that are available in the colleges and universities that you're looking at. How much paperwork is required? What's that process like? And if somebody doesn't know something, are they willing to help you find the answer, or do they just push you off and say that's not our department? Okay. Encouraging peer supports and clubs. There's a lot of different clubs on campus. There's a lot of different supports for students with disabilities. There's formal and informal disability support groups on campuses, and it's important for students to find where those are and to realize that it might take some time. One of the things that we heard so much from students in our study is that they never disclosed that they were a student with a disability. So if they were a student that needed, say, time and a half on a test, and sometimes if that's needed, students will, maybe there will be a proctor for that exam or for that test right at the Disability Services office. So as an instructor, I would send my test there to be proctored, knowing that some of the students in my class with a disability, based on the letter that they submitted as part of their accommodation process, might need time and a half. What we heard from students is that when they went in there, they recognized people that were friends of theirs that they didn't know also had a disability. So I think we have to, and this is for all of us, is how do we destigmatize and normalize disability? how do we help students find their peers in those needed support areas, again, formally and informally within colleges and universities. So one of the other pieces that I wanted to talk about is preparing for online learning. Navigating college and university is difficult, is challenging. Navigating colleges and university in an online environment can be even more challenging. Now I want to say some things about online. I've been teaching online ever since I started teaching. I've been teaching online for adult learners, for traditional college students. I've done it for continuing education, for professionals in the areas. I've done it on multiple different platforms. I've done it synchronous or asynchronous, which I'll get to. But online learning is a great opportunity if it works for you. For some students, learning online might be challenging. What's challenging for a lot of students and for faculty, because of COVID right now, many of us don't have that option. So if online learning might be the only piece that's accessible to you. So it's important, again, try it. And just like any college classroom, you have to try it and find what works. So what I would recommend is getting some experience with trying online, because that's not something that's going to go away. When you get into an employment, your continuing education, your seminars, your different certifications that you might need might all be offered online. So online learning is something that is here to stay. So it's important that you get the opportunity to practice that as much as possible. So practice, practice, practice. Try different formats. So synchronous versus asynchronous. So synchronous is our class meets 10 to 12 on Monday and Wednesday. We're going to show up online through Zoom, 10 to 12, Monday and Wednesday. Asynchronous is the class is online. Here's the week's materials. You complete it at your own pace. So for some, and you might have a mix of that. You might have a flipped classroom where, and I'm sure many of you are experiencing this or have experienced this in K through 12. So here's the lecture, it's recorded, watch it, come back and we're going to discuss, come back and we're going to do a group activity. So this can look very different. The platforms, the resources, they are popping up left and right. You can't keep up. There's different apps that students can use to stay engaged, to submit homework, to collaborate on homework together online. So I'd say as much exposure that you can get to this as a student and find out what you like or don't like would definitely be something that I would recommend. Find out the different platforms that universities use. So when you go do a campus visit, ask them, do they use Canvas? Do they use Moodle? Do they use Angel? Do they use Blackboard? That's a course platform, the course management system. So as an instructor, I put all of my material on at Penn State, we use Canvas. So that's where students access all of my course material. It's important to understand what that looks like. Is it accessible if you have a specific disability and need specific accommodations? Is that material accessible through that platform? Make sure that good internet is important. This is so challenging. One thing that I really hope is a problem that gets solved through this experience that we're going through right now with COVID is that we make good internet accessible to more people. For example, we live 20 minutes away from a Research One university, and we still have internet only available through our phone, or through the phone line. So we don't have high-speed internet where we live. I've had to get a MiFi booster in order to do any type of video. So it's important to know the type of internet that's needed. So if the university you're looking at has mostly synchronous, where you're going to have to be online participating in a class together. If you have not good internet service, it would be good to figure out a backup plan. So making sure that you have good internet is very important. Use headphones for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it helps minimize background noise. But it helps create, I think this is the biggest challenge. And as an instructor, as I've tried, I no longer control my classroom. I don't have students coming in, I close the door, I see them, and we're going to be talking as a class for the next hour and a half, 2 hours. I don't have that control anymore when we're teaching online. So my students can be anywhere, and I don't want my students locked in a room taking my class necessarily, but I do want them to be present. I don't want others that might be in the room hearing our conversations, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean, I want to protect the other students in my classes that might want to share something personal. I want to make sure that we're creating that collaborative environment in a class, which can be difficult when the world is your classroom right now. So again, there's pros and cons to everything. So I try to get students to use the headphones and if they can be in a area where there's not a lot of other people around for distractions or for noise, that's really important. Making sure that you mute. I can tell you that this was a problem for faculty. I've heard some very amusing stories of folks that did not mute or did not shut their video off when they thought a meeting was over. So make sure that you mute. I would say make sure that you, and this is, I think, challenging when we're preparing for online learning, is if we're doing it via Zoom, a lot of students will shut their cameras off. And I've been reading different things of what works for students. For some students, they feel more comfortable with that and then will enter into the conversation when needed. So I think this is where it comes down to try something different, but also be prepared, as instructors might say, I want to see you. So turn your camera on. So it's important, you know, and also the picture that you're going to show, if you are going to have your camera shut off, what's going to be your screensaver. All of these just little things are important for us to keep in mind. Make sure that you realize that you are on camera. What's going on in your background, what's hanging on your wall. All of those pieces are critical when you're learning virtual. Synchronous versus asynchronous, I talked about this a little bit. So what works best for you? Do you prefer to be online in a class at a specific time, participating together? Or do you prefer being able to complete the material at your own pace, watching videos at your own time? Also think of the time frame of classes. I teach a 6 to 9 hour class, or a 3-hour class 1 night a week. That is very difficult to do in person. It's even more difficult to do via Zoom. There's a thing called Zoom fatigue, and it's real. I'm hearing more and more students and more faculty talking about how much more energy it takes to stay focused during a Zoom call or a Zoom meeting. So it's important that you understand what your own needs are. If you find that short interactive experiences are better, try to find a class that's going to match that. And if not, how can you request that as an accommodation, or how can you look at trying to create that environment that works best for you? The other thing is how to build a community online. I think what's interesting is we've relied on online and virtual interactions for fun for many years. So we have texting, we have chat rooms, we have social media, we have all of these different platforms where we're used to interacting with people online. So that's nothing new. But what is new is not having that opportunity to connect in person if we need to. So how do we build community online? Find your hobbies, find what you like to do. Students are still doing clubs and gaming activities and attending lectures and guest speakers and doing exercises. You know, if they can't go to the building on campus, they're holding virtual exercises for people to complete on their own time. So the colleges and universities are doing everything they can to help bring that online, or bring that community that exists on a campus online. So it's if you can try to navigate that and start doing that before you enter college, I think it will be beneficial for you. It helps you understand what you like to do. And again, find your people. Find a way to take a large university and make it small. Even if it's not a large university, find a way to connect with people and build your community at the university or college you plan on attending. So that is my presentation. Here's some information. If you have questions, to contact the FAU card, there's their phone number, their email, and their website. I have got my contact information that will be provided. I also have the references available for this presentation. But again, I'm happy to share anything that I used in providing you information or resources for this webinar. And any other additional information that you think might be needed, feel free to reach out. I know we're going to have a follow-up to this in order for you to be able to submit some questions. So I look forward to that next step of our community I think we're building as part of this process. So I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope you found these resources helpful and beneficial as you start your journey into becoming a successful college student. Take care.